What's that they always say? That there's always a silver lining? Like everybody else, I was put under house arrest during the pandemic. And after 3 or 4 days, I was already starting to go up the wall. I live alone in a small 1-bedroom apartment, and I have no friends. That's just how it is. And soon I was dying of boredom. A guy can only surf so much porn and drink so many tall boys of strong beer before that too was boring. Interesting that the liquor stores were deemed essential services, while the office where I worked was shuttered and dark. So that's when I started leaving the apartment at night. Not to walk around, although I probably could have used the exercise. Just to drive. Driving was amazing. The pandemic made people stay home, so the roads, all of them, even the expressways and major thoroughfares, were empty of traffic, making it a real pleasure to just drive. And so I drove around, listening to music and talk radio, and cruised through the silent midnight world revealed by my headlights. I saw a few other cars, and even fewer people. But occasionally I would catch sight of a girl or woman walking alone, walking totally alone, with no one else around, and my mind would start thinking. What if I tried not to think about it, to stop thinking about it. I'd drink myself into a stupor, but when I came to, the thoughts were still there. About how easy it would be to snatch one of these women off the streets. And then, who would know? Who would know? But maybe the cops would know. Like I said, there weren't a lot of cars around, but there were cop cars, and what if they noticed me? Maybe they were keeping track of everybody's plates. One night, I just couldn't sleep. So after tossing and turning for hours, I finally got up out of bed, grabbed my keys, and was gone. 6 a.m. The sun was getting ready to come up on our wintry landscape. And there were people around. I had no idea there were people that would get up so early by choice. There were a couple of people out walking dogs, mainly older people, and a jogger. A female jogger. I only caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, a blonde in a dark tracksuit, running along the side of a long, lonely road. I only had a quick glance, so I did a wide swing round through the side streets and doubled back so I could come up behind her. The tracksuit was black, with silver stripes running down the arms and down the legs. But I was captivated, hypnotized by the back and forth movement of her blonde ponytail and by the twitching of her tight, muscular behind. Her twitching, switching behind, her blonde ponytail swinging back and forth. There was no one else around. We were alone. There was nothing, and no one to stop me. I was at the liquor store as soon as it was open, and then went home and drank myself into unconsciousness. I woke up feeling like deep-fried shit, but the thought was still there. I could grab her, have her, and no one could stop me. And I would make sure she never told anyone. I was back in the car at 6 next morning and drove. I turned onto the long, straight, lonely road where I had seen her the other day. And believe it or not, I was actually praying she wouldn't be there, so I couldn't do what I was going to do. She was there. I drove up the street very slowly, in part so she wouldn't hear or take any notice of me, and maybe partly to stop what I knew was going to happen. But no matter how slowly I went, I was soon drawing up beside her. And that's when she finally turned and looked at me. Blue eyes, beautiful wide blue eyes. And she knew and turned and began sprinting towards a nearby park. I was out of the car and after her, and I was committed now. No turning back. I couldn't turn back, and I couldn't let her get away, and I'm not in very good shape, but I was running furiously, and I was gaining on her, and all the time my effort was fueled by rage at all the women who sneered at me and said no to me, who laughed and disrespected me, rage to get my own back at them for causing my nervous tension through sex, corrosive, searing rage, the rage to possess and ravage and destroy. I was almost upon her, but then she stopped, just a few feet away from me, stopped dead, and then turned around. She was beautiful, a beautiful, beautiful girl, and she smiled at me with her full red lips, her large, lustrous blue eyes, and she opened her mouth as if ready for a kiss. And she opened it, and she opened it, and she opened it, wider and wider and wider, till her face seemed to disappear, and her mouth became a gaping orifice, lined with rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and she leaned forward and pulled me towards her. She was so strong. She pulled me towards her and leaned forward and tore off my nose. Her arms wrapped around me and held me, arms incredibly strong, and I realized they had morphed into tentacles. And as I fell down the elevator shaft from consciousness into darkness, I realized she was actually eating my face. Eating my face. And my last thought was, the experts and the authorities were right. You should just stay home. Leviathan. In that day, the Lord, with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. Isaiah 27:1. John sat on a park bench and wondered just what the hell he was going to do. On a recent trip home, his uncle had noticed his subdued and somewhat depressed manner, and had chided him for lacking in spirit. "When I was your age," he announced in his too loud voice, "the world was my oyster. The world was my oyster." I'm kind of having trouble making ends meet," John mumbled, embarrassed and wishing his uncle would just go away. "Oh, don't worry about that," the great man pronounced. "As long as you have your health, you have everything." Well, John was healthy and whole, and that was about all. Otherwise, he was broke, in spite of working 3 shitty part-time jobs, and in danger of not making the rent and of being tossed out into the street. He had no prospects either, having to spend all his time trying to keep his head above water. And romance? Forget about it. Nobody loves a loser, not even the loser himself. John had come to the big smoke with such high hopes, but so did 100,000 others, each and every year, and he found himself lost in the shuffle, and sitting on a park bench, killing time until he could start his night cleaning job, and wondering if he had anything to eat at home other than KD. John was staring into space when he noticed the car, a brand spanking new Beamer coupe. I wish I had a car like that, John thought bitterly, as he watched the driver, a young man like himself, climbing out. "Lucky bastard," he said under his breath, until he saw the cane in the man's hand. Maybe health did count for something. The man slowly hobbled towards him and appeared to be dragging his right leg. And then with a start, John realized he knew him. His name was Burton, and John had gone to school with him, although they were acquaintances, not buddies. In fact, John hadn't liked him very much, and had never given him a thought after leaving school. And now Burton was heading directly towards him. "Hello, John," he said, breathing heavily, his brow wet with sweat. "I thought it was you." John was instantly on his feet, making room for Burton, who sat down with obvious relief. "What happened to you?" John said, so shocked his brain didn't have time for normal filtering. Burton flashed a smile which didn't completely erase his pained expression. "It's a long story," he said, smiling. Or was it grimacing? "But what about you? What are you up to these days?" "Not much," John admitted, before filling in all the gory, or rather boring details. "I feel your pain, bro," Burton said, which caused John to involuntarily shudder. "That was my experience, too, when I first got here." "But you're doing all right now," John said, genuinely curious as to the source of Burton's prosperity. "Yeah, and you can, too." John waited, wondering if Burton was going to offer him a lead on a good job, maybe even make an actual job offer. But instead, he invited him to dinner in a trendy restaurant John had never heard of, but which he knew he couldn't afford. He began to make excuses. After all, he did have to go to work in a few hours. But Burton told him not to worry. They could meet up when John was free, and best of all, he would pick up the tab. Which is how John ended up sitting across the table as Burton recommended rabbit and another dish with chanterelle mushrooms. And all the while, he felt shabby and out of place. Even the excellent wine didn't improve his spirits. And he was also distracted by the fact that Burton kept scanning the room. He was obviously waiting for someone. Someone, no doubt, more interesting than his old university acquaintance. Burton always seemed to have a perpetually distressed expression on his face. But that was understandable due to his physical condition. Apparently, he had lost his right foot, although he hadn't explained how. But then his face suddenly brightened, and turning, John saw a short, squat, middle-aged man with a beaming, benevolent smile approaching their table. "John, I want you to meet my friend Lev. He's the being who made my prosperity possible." "It is a pleasure to meet you, John," Lev said with a smile. "I've heard so much about you and your, predicament." John noticed Lev spoke with a slight accent. Already uncomfortable, he was unhappy that his financial embarrassment was being discussed by strangers, and he included Burton in that estimation too. Hell, he hardly knew the guy. He took a sip of wine to avoid having to say anything, and then the whole situation suddenly became crystal clear. This was some kind of scam. Well, he'd just have to play along with it and see what the pitch was. "And how did you go about making Burton's prosperity possible?" Lev laughed in delight and turned to Burton. "Your friend is very direct." "He was always pretty outspoken," Burton replied, although he didn't appear to be amused. "What we have to offer," Lev told John, who noticed he'd said "we," "is wealth in exchange for sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" asked John, confused. "I believe the term is a pound of flesh. And thus the question for you, John, is what part of the body would you be willing to give up for unlimited wealth?" John appeared to ponder the question, as both men regarded him intently. He was unsure of his ground, and began to wonder if he was the victim of some weird practical joke. In the end, he figured the best plan was to simply answer honestly. "None of them. I wouldn't give up anything." "I see," Lev said quietly. "But how do you propose to pay your rent when it falls due?" John went red with anger. How could he know that? Or was it simply a lucky guess? Either way, he didn't like it, nor did he like people making fun of him. Lev seemed to understand. "Please don't be angry, my young friend. The people I represent are well aware of your financial impecuniousness, as they are also aware of most things in the world." "And who exactly are these people?" John demanded. "They are known by many names," Lev began. John provided one. "Well, that is a vulgar name for them," Lev conceded. "I thought they were interested in souls." "Souls are rather thin gruel," Lev chuckled. "Besides, most people today do not possess one." "Well, what exactly do they do with these pounds of flesh?" John sneered. Burton, who had been sourly observing this exchange, suddenly exploded. "Don't be such a bloody fool. You'll never have an opportunity like this again. And what are you now? Little better than a bum." "Maybe," John shot back, "but I'm not naive. Tell me, how did you really lose your foot?" "I signed a contract, and the next morning, when I woke up, I found it had been surgically removed." "A contract?" John said. Lev pushed a legal document across the table towards John, who picked it up and began scanning the fine print, which was exceedingly difficult to follow. As he read, Lev spoke. "What this document says is that we agree to provide you with unlimited funds in terms of both cash and precious metals in return for the body part or organ of your choice. It can be a hand, or a foot, an arm, or a leg, higher payouts for those, an eye, or an ear. A pair of ears is a popular choice. So what would you give?" An expensive-looking pen lay on the table. John grabbed it, scrawled something on the contract, and then stormed out of the restaurant. Burton and Lev sat in embarrassed silence, and then the older man picked up the contract. At first he scowled, but then his face broke into a sardonic smile. Without saying a word, he handed the document to Burton, who read, "You can have my middle leg. Yours truly, John Thomas." And Burton smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. Next morning, John staggered out of bed butt naked, still soured from his dinner with Burton and Lev. It was bad enough to be broke and struggling, without having affluent people making fun of you, as John was sure that the dinner had been an ignorant attempt to humiliate him. But he was in for a shock when he entered his tiny, grotty bathroom. The sink was filled with what appeared to be gold coins. The bathtub, too. And then John looked into the mirror, looked below his waist, and... No! Today, John, like Burton, is a wealthy man, but he cries all the way to the bank. It's kind of like being all dressed up with no place to go. So, dear listener, what would you give up for unlimited wealth? Think carefully. The choice is yours. Alan hated Luther. Hated him so much, he planned to kill him. But before we continue, I should point out that Luther was a cat. A fine black beast with penetrating green eyes, which he used to stare at Alan, much to Alan's discomfort. Alan was a librarian and supposedly in charge of a large suburban branch. Luther was one of his employees, as in chief mouser and assistant pest control specialist. Not that Luther did much in the way of catching mice. Instead, he spent most of his time lolling around on the furniture or the circ desk, visiting older patrons and running away from the children, intent on mauling him. And in tormenting Alan, of course. Alan detested cats, and with the unerring instincts of his breed, Luther haunted him for the pleasure of getting under the librarian's skin. If Alan left the office, sometimes only for a moment, he would find Luther curled up on his chair and disinclined to budge. Then, once Alan had succeeded in removing him, he would jump up onto his desk, dislodge his papers, sprawl across the librarian's keyboard, and make a general nuisance of himself. It was just as bad outside of the office. Luther would follow Alan around, even following him to the washroom, where he would wait outside the door to resume shadowing when the librarian emerged. But his worst trick was to run between Alan's legs as he was walking up or down the stairs, making him stumble and on a few occasions actually fall down. "That thing is going to kill me someday," Alan would mutter in anger. But it was the fury of impotence, since everyone else, both staff and patrons, loved Luther and were very protective of him. "He's just trying to make friends," Alan's staff would say. But Alan wasn't fooled. He could see the malevolence lurking in Luther's kryptonite green eyes, and when they were alone, he would talk to it. "Come on, Luther, leave me alone," and then plead with it. "Why must you pester me so? Please, please leave me alone." But Luther would just stare at him, with the ghost of a feline smile, and Alan knew he was just going to have to live, or at least coexist with it, with Luther. But one cold winter evening, as Alan worked after hours, alone, Luther went too far. Alan was walking up the stairs between the main level and his office, a mug of freshly brewed coffee in hand, when Luther darted rapidly between his feet, causing him to stumble. The librarian narrowly avoided falling, but managed to pour boiling hot coffee all over the front of his shirt and all over the crotch of his trousers. Ouch! Sputtering and swearing, he stalked off to the washroom to clean himself off, while Luther made himself scarce. When Alan finally emerged, he headed for the basement, and when he returned, he had something in his hands. As for Luther, he was keeping Alan's office chair warm for him by sleeping on it. But he woke up when Alan came in and slammed the door shut behind him. The object Alan had in his hand looked like a small laundry bag with a string tie, one of the bags used by the children's librarians to hold picture books, puppets, etc. But this one ended up holding a particularly ornery, hissing, spitting black cat. Not that Luther went without a fight, and Alan had some vivid scratch marks on his face before he managed to tie the bag shut. The area had just experienced a real Canadian blizzard, and there were glacier-sized mountains of snow piled up along the sides of the roads. Alan, with his squirming captive by his side, drove through the snow-bound streets and eventually pulled to the side of a bridge spanning a partially frozen creek, where he calmly tossed the sack over the rail and down into the water, ice, and snow. "That ought to take care of you," Alan said grimly. He then drove home, and that night he slept like a baby. The next day, the staff tore the library apart in their futile attempts to find Luther. One of the clerks asked Alan, "You don't think Luther got out, do you?" Alan shrugged. "Seems to me it had a good sense of self-preservation." Of course, the clerk noticed that Alan had referred to Luther in the past tense and called him an it. She had also noticed the scratch marks on his face, but said nothing. Alan, after all, was technically the boss. But tongues wagged in the staff room, and the patrons were sad, especially the children. The library's art gallery decided to help the situation by hanging a huge painting of a black cat with emerald green eyes on the wall of the main floor directly across from the circ desk. Everybody loved it. Everybody but Alan, for the cat's eyes seemed to follow him everywhere. "That picture looks just like Luther, doesn't it, Alan?" gushed one of the clerks. "It's like he's come back to us." Alan admitted the resemblance and inwardly shuddered. And a week later, the black cat returned, in the form of a stuffed animal. It was a large, plush black cat with green button eyes, a pink nose, and a curvy pink smile. Around its throat, it wore a small placard which said, "The cat came back." It was sitting on a chair in Alan's office, and when he came in and turned on the lights, he barely suppressed a scream. The damn thing looked just like Luther. When he confronted the staff, they professed complete ignorance of the stuffed toy, which they promptly dubbed Luther, and about where it came from. Maybe the children's department sent it to us, they suggested, since they know how most of us miss Luther. But the children's department hadn't sent it. The staff quickly installed it at the circ desk for everyone to admire, but that didn't stop it from following Alan around like some kind of weird voodoo fetish. The voodoo Luther was always ending up in Alan's office, on his chair, his desk, his keyboard, or in the staff room, sitting on the table across from him when he went to eat, and also on the stairs. He tried to keep it from getting on his nerves, but it did, so he chastised the staff about it during one of their regular meetings. I wish you guys would stop putting that thing where I can trip over it. It's always in my office, in the staff room, even on the stairs. But Alan, one of the clerks protested, Luther never leaves the circ desk. The rest nodded in agreement and looked at each other, a look which said, he's losing it. Maybe he was. When he calmed down, Alan had to admit that Luther only appeared on the stairs when he was alone in the building, so no one else could have put it there. The damn thing couldn't move by itself, could it? Could it? Could it? Alan had to work alone in the library from time to time, and that's when things began to get weird. When he found Luther on the stairs, he would return it to the circ desk, and a few minutes later, it would be back on the steps. Alan would lock it in a closet downstairs or throw it in the dumpster outside. But in a few minutes, it would be back on the stairs again. It got worse. Alan didn't bother to turn on all the lights when he was alone in the building, and as he worked in his office, he was always hearing faint sounds or seeing things out of the corner of his eye. But when he stopped to look, there was nothing there. And when he stopped to listen, dead silence. At first. But one night, he became aware of a faint but steady sound. So soft and distant, he thought it was just the wind outside the building. But it became louder and clearer, and he recognized it as the mewing of a cat. Alan tried to ignore it at first, telling himself it was outside and no concern of his, particularly if it was some damn cat. But the noise kept increasing, and he began to wonder if it was coming from somewhere inside. And then he thought, was it Luther? Had Luther come back? Alan couldn't take it anymore and began to frantically search the building. But racing from his office, he almost tripped over the toy Luther, which would have caused him to fall down the stairs and break his neck. He booted the stuffy in anger, causing it to fly through the air and crash somewhere in the stacks, while the black cat in the humongous painting regarded him with baleful and reproachful eyes. Alan explored all 3 floors, the main floor, the office floor, and the basement, and found nothing. But he could still hear it, and could still sense movement all around him, black things darting past him, just out of sight. He gave up and went to a nearby bar for a pint to calm his nerves. Or 2 pints. Or 3. And he was muttering to himself by the time he got home. God damn that Luther. Is he still alive and come back? I should have done what that guy did to that one-eyed cat in that Post story. The black cat. I should have hanged it. I should have hanged it. Hang it, I should have hanged it. And with that regret, Alan lay down on his bed, fully dressed, and fell sound asleep. When he awoke, he found himself in darkness, save for the light from a few tall green candles. But in spite of the gloom, he recognized his surroundings, the large meeting room in his library. Alan wasn't alone. The room was filled with large black cats, all sitting and staring at him, some on chairs, some on tables, and some on the floor, eyes yellow and green, with the occasional eyes of blue. Dead silence. But Alan knew instinctively that this was a trial, and that he was the accused, and that the charge was murder. A ripple of movement ran through the assembled felines, and suddenly a half-starved beast, as white as it was black, limped up onto the table and raised an injured paw, pointing directly at Alan. It was Luther. Alan wouldn't have recognized it. It was so different from the sleek, well-fed cat which had been his nemesis. And he wasn't sure if it was alive or if he was looking at a ghost. But he did know the raised paw was both an accusation and a sentence. Death. The clouder, the court of black cats, began to move towards him, forcing him out the door of the meeting room and across the floor to the head of the stairs, where a noose hung down from an overhead beam. Alan turned to see Luther on a step at the bottom of the stairs. Once again, Luther raised his damaged paw, and the noose fell around the librarian's neck. And then Luther's paw dropped. Something struck Alan on the back of the neck, and he felt like he was falling. When staff arrived the following morning, they found Alan's body at the foot of the stairs. His neck was broken, a fact which puzzled the chief medical officer who performed the autopsy. Falling down the short flight of stairs should have resulted, at most, in a broken arm. But then, he was also puzzled by what looked like rope burns around Alan's neck. The branch was closed for several days, and staff were given access to counseling. But they recovered rather quickly. And the day after reopening, Luther returned. He was outside the main door when staff came in the morning, his frost-damaged fur more white than black. He was missing one of his green eyes, and his sinister paw was frostbitten. But it was definitely Luther, and he was soon safely terrorizing the new librarian, Lisa, who liked cats and wasn't bothered by his attentions or his intentions. So, should you ever have occasion to visit this particular, and perhaps accursed, library branch, you will find both Luther and his plush mannequin regally installed at the circulation desk, unless he's in Lisa's office, trying to bug her. And be sure to check out the colossal painting of the black cat with the kryptonite eyes. And if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you'll see some vandal has scratched a little symbol into the paint. Ever play hangman? That symbol. A hanged man. Greetings, dear listeners. Here, by popular demand, is the green screen version of the video we shot by the Too Noisy Fountain. I trust you'll be able to better hear this strange story of the security guard and the whisperers in darkness. Warren, I've been listening to some of your videos about shadow people, but lately I've been experiencing something completely different, but equally frightening and strange. I worked a graveyard shift, totally alone, in an office building downtown. The front doors are locked at night, and every hour I'm expected to do a complete circuit of the building, visiting all floors and walking through the darkened offices and meeting rooms. Most of my rounds are conducted in semi-darkness, so shadows and shadow people are not a concern, as I wouldn't be able to see them. But a few nights back, as I made my way along a darkened corridor on one of the upper floors, I saw, at the end of the long straight hall, a pair of white glowing eyes, glowing as intensely as LED lights. I immediately shone my flashlight towards them, only to find nothing there. I called out, "Hello? Hello, anyone there?" But of course, I didn't get a response. I continued my rounds in a state of anxiety, shining my light into dark corners and constantly looking about. From time to time, I caught flashes of white and occasionally red, which I thought must have been eyes. But there was never anyone there. And that's when the whispering started. At first, only my name, over and over. But then, whole sentences. I found it hard to hear at first. The whispers barely audible. But over time, they increased in volume, an irritating undertone, like the scratching of rats in the wall. And I realized they were giving a running commentary on every shameful thing I had ever done in my life. The stuff you want to forget about. Sometimes the mysterious whisperers repeated hurtful and ignorant remarks I had made to others, words I would gladly have taken back, but couldn't. And now they were being repeated where anyone could hear them and learn what kind of man I really was. I was horrified, but also mortified. I began to talk back to them. Talk back even though I was the only one there. And after 10 minutes of this, I was reduced to actually screaming, "Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!" The whispers began to increase in volume, as if moving to a crescendo, and I instinctively turned on all the lights, all of them, so the floor I was on was bathed in light. And the whispers stopped, finally stopped. But they started up again, started where I had left off, as soon as I turned the lights off again. So now I turn on all the lights when I patrol. I even turn on all the lights at home, even sleep with the lights on, because the whisperers in darkness are still there, louder now, and telling me they're going to get me, that I'm going to die. What is happening to me? I wondered if I was going nuts. But then I remembered a number of other guards who had worked at the building had quit or asked to be reassigned. I got hold of one of them the other day. It took several beers, but he finally admitted the exact same thing had happened to him when he worked there alone. What is happening to me? And what is doing it? You once asked in jest if there were echo people to go along with the shadow people. And there are. For these whisperers in darkness whisper echoes of my worst moments. Name withheld. So what do you think, dear listeners? Is my friend being victimized by shadow people? Or are there such things as echo people? My money is on earthbound spirits as only an entity from the spirit world would know all my friends' dirty secrets. Imagine someone or something broadcasting all your worst moments and worst words out loud and in public. Yikes. So please share your thoughts below. As well, I'm experimenting today with a green screen. So let me know what you think of the results. And stay safe. I'm not sure where to put my eyes in this situation, but here we go. Stay safe. Stay subscribed. Ring the bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos. And please feel free to share this video or any of my videos or any of my material with anyone you please. If this is your first visit to my channel, my name is Warren. I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories about cryptids such as the night floaters, werewolves, and the shadow people. So I hope you will consider subscribing. And let's all stay hungry. Till midnight. Cheers.